my name is Ben Wilson. Today's date is March 25th, 2019. I am interviewing Dr. Frank Felsenstein on the Ball State campus as part of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project. Thank you, Frank, for coming today and participating in the effort which we're conducting during the Honors College's 60th anniversary year. I'd like to begin by asking where you were born and when you were born.
I was born in London, England, in 1944. And when I was born, there were flying bombs dropping on London. It was the final year of the war, and the Germans had these rockets which they fired from the Low Countries, and it was a pretty risky time, if you like, to be in London. When I was 6 weeks old, I was evacuated to Yorkshire, where it was relatively safe. My father was in the army, and he stayed on in London at that time.
And then could you just describe a little bit about your childhood as well? You just discussed a little bit about
so,
early years.
So I grew up in London. Both of my parents were refugees from Nazi Germany. And one of the things which I suppose was characteristic of people who had escaped from the Holocaust at that time was that they didn't want to talk about it. You know, they wanted to put that behind us and to make our childhood, I have a sister, younger sister, to make our childhood as normal as possible. And it's only sort of, whilst I was probably somewhat older, that I, by dribs and drabs, learned a little bit more about the experience of my parents.
And then, so you mentioned your father was in World War II for the British Army. Could you describe the careers your parents had while you were growing up as well?
My father was a little older than my mother, about 11 years. He was born in the final year of the 19th century, so 1899, and both my parents were from Germany. And my father went to school. His family, my family, if you like, at that time, had a very old business that had been going for about 300 years in the fur trade. And it was known as the Gebrüder Felsenstein, the brothers Felsenstein, and there were various partners. And my grandfather, who died 10 years before I was born, was the head partner. And the idea was that each of the partners was allowed to have 2 sons in the business. My father was one of 7 children. He was probably, there were 2 of them who had an academic bent. He was one of them. But of the 7 children, 5 were girls, and girls didn't count when it came to that. So he and his older brother were sort of directed into the business. And he was at school at the beginning of the First World War. And most of the people who were members of the business were called up. And he was, if you think about it, 1899, so he would have been 14, 15, something like that when the war started. But by the time he was 17, he was called up. And he fought in the trenches on the German side in the First World War. So you've got this reversal, if you like. I don't know whether you've seen it. There is a remarkable film that came out late last year, and it's being shown in the US now, called They Shall Not Grow Old. Peter Jackson, who did the Lord of the Rings, directed those movies, directed this, and it's based on military films that were made, if you can think about it, with an old crank camera, you know, rather less advanced than the camera that you're using today. And they had about 100 hours of film in the War Museum in London. And out of those, he was able to get 6 hours, which he could use. And if you can imagine a film of that era, it's very, very juddery like that. And modern technology, you can get rid of the judders like that. He was able to colorize it and in a most remarkable way. And then the other thing, you see my lips moving in that way, that they got professional lip readers in, and they were able to work out what these people were saying. And they came from the north of England, so they found actors who could reproduce what they were saying. And you've got this extraordinary and very, very frightening film of what it was like to be in the trenches on the British side. But the British soldiers said that the people, although they were their enemies, the people they were closest with were the Germans, because they were doing exactly the same. And it shows pictures of, that they would be advancing from one trench to another, and we'd see a group of soldiers, and you'd be sure that most of those were dead by the time they went a few yards. They were just mown down by machine gun fire. So, and the wounded, and the rats that were there, the lice. I mean, it was just horrific to see this. And that film, for the first time, I really got a sense of what my father had been through. And about 2 weeks before the armistice, this film was made to commemorate the armistice, sort of 1918, 2018. So about 2 weeks before the armistice, he was in the trenches, and shrapnel from a shell managed to damage him very severely in the leg, and he was carried to a field hospital. And the doctors looked at him and looked at his leg, said, "We have to amputate." And my father was conscious, and he struggled, and he looked across, and there was a bowl full of limbs of that had been amputated from other soldiers. He struggled, and eventually they said, "Well, if you risk gangrene, but we'll put you on a train." And he could not remember, but for 3 days he was on a train which took him to Leipzig. His mother got him into hospital straight away, and he was in hospital for about 6 months or so, and recovered fully. He didn't have a limp or anything like that, but throughout his life he had shrapnel in his legs. Now, the story I've told you, he only told me once, and it was so memorable that I'm working on a book based on my parents' experience. But that seems to me a significant part of it, thinking about his terrifying experience then, and the oddity of fighting on the German side in the First World War, the Great War as it's sometimes called, and then on the British side in the Second World War. He was what's called the Home Guard there. So in other words, he was old enough, or he was too old to be sent to the continent to fight there, but he was among a group of people who were trying to rescue those who were in houses that were firebombed, and he did quite a lot of rescue work and got a medal for that at the end of the war, which I think most people who fought in the war, it wasn't very special to get that. But an extraordinary and rather frightening experience that he went through. My mother was also he was from Leipzig, she was from Frankfurt, and she was, in 1933, she was a finals year medical student, and that's the clinical year when you're working in hospital. She worked in a clinic just on the other side of the river in Frankfurt, on the other side of the mine, and she was working in a ward there. And a woman patient, she went to see her. How are you? And this woman started attacking her as a dirty Jew, and this, that, and the other, and then called the orderly, and the orderly said, "What has happened?" And "How could you do this?" he said. "Out!" And my mother was cast out of medical school in 1933. She came to England, where she'd had an aunt who was no longer alive, but she'd been to England many times, and she thought, well, this is where I will be able to complete my medical training. But the British said, no, you have to do not just the final year, but you have to do all 6 years plus the matriculation, the Abitur exam. And she still had her parents, and at that time a sister, living in Frankfurt, and obviously her primary thing was to try and get them out. So her career as a doctor, never materialized, and she went into personnel management, was very successful with that, a completely different career, which she said, in many ways was very suited to her temperament. So she was in England from 1933, And in 1936, she visited, it was the first time that she visited Germany since having to flee. And 1936 was a year which was in some ways very different from the previous years and afterwards, because the Germans were hosting the Olympic Games. And so all the anti-Jewish signs which were all over the place were removed temporarily during first the Winter Games and then during the Summer Games. And the anti-Semitic laws were not enforced in the way that they had been so rigorously. So she went to visit this cousin, and my grandmother said, well, have a good time whilst you're there. Don't get involved with anybody. Of course, she met my father, and they fell in love with one another. He was about to move to Palestine. Two of his siblings had gone there. He went to Palestine, and then instead of going back to Germany, he went via London, proposed to my mother, and a long relationship. They were able to get married in 1937. But he was still in Germany until the summer of 1937. And then he traveled, it was the first time he'd done this, on a business trip to the Soviet Union. And whilst he was there, one of his cousins got a message through to him, don't come back, the Gestapo, the SS, has raided your apartment. There's an arrest warrant out for you. So he never went back to Germany, and had to go backwards and forwards from the Soviet Union with no passport, because they'd removed his German passports. He had what were called stateless papers. And the remarkable thing is that they corresponded on a daily basis, and it's really their correspondence which I'm editing.
So you mentioned the discrimination your parents faced during their time while they were meeting. Did you face any discrimination for your religion during your childhood? To an extent. I think there were a few people who engaged in things which, looking at them now, were probably anti-Semitic, but on the whole it was a fairly normal childhood. And could you describe a little bit about your high school and what you might have done during your high school years? Or?
Yeah, I might start with elementary and prep school.
Let's go ahead.
My oldest friend actually was in kindergarten with me, and he's not Jewish, and his family were very welcoming to me throughout. There was another boy who was in my class with me and lived relatively close by, and we used to go and play in each other's houses. And on one occasion, he came up to me and said, we can no longer play together. And I said, what, have I done something? What's the matter? And he said, my parents have said that Jews take young Christian children and murder them, and they don't want you to play with me because of that. I'd never heard anything like that. I went and spoke to my parents about it and said, this seems very strange. And they said, this is ridiculous. The following day I saw him again. He said, well, I've spoken with my parents. And they say, well, the Jews used to do it, kill young Christian boys as part of the Passover ritual. Now they just kill animals. Very bizarre, but whatever, that friendship ended on that day. And I think that's an example of that was the most overt example of anti-Semitism that I came across. Many years later, I looked up the name of this guy on the internet and found that he was a company director of a large company in Britain. I hope that one can blame his parents rather than him. Just to continue through. So that was at preparatory school, and then I went to a secondary school. That was a private school, or in England it's called a public school. It was 800 years old. It was one of the oldest schools. I went there for a year and it closed. And I then went to a state school, a grammar school, a very, very good school. And from there to university, I went to the University of Leeds, did my undergraduate work there. When I graduated, I had the opportunity to either stay on and do graduate work there, or I was offered a TA position at McMaster in Canada, and I decided the terms of the British one were very good. And after I'd been a graduate student for a couple of years, to my surprise, I was offered a very junior professorship. It was assistant professeur, this was in Switzerland at the University of Geneva, and it's a very hierarchical institution, or was at that time. And the number of senior professors who would say assistant professeur, that means assistant, not professeur. But it was a good experience, and I began my teaching career. I hadn't finished my doctorate at the time, and I went back to England to complete it. And to my utter surprise at that time, because it was not somewhere I thought of applying, but I was asked to apply to my old university, and I taught at the University of Leeds right through until 1998. In the mid-1980s, I was over in America for the wedding of a cousin of mine, and sat next to a young lady, and she's my wife, and she's American, and we decided that in the longer term we would probably move to the United States, but we were 11 or 12 years of our first 11 or 12 years of our marriage, we were still in Great Britain. And her work was with an international consultancy company, and they offered to move her to the United States. So we left Britain in 1998. Very difficult decision, just as hers had been, because she was in a program with a large telephone company in the US, and she gave that up, and rebuilt her career in Great Britain very successfully. So it was my turn to do something like that. The first few months I was simply looking after our kids. We have 2 children. And then I was offered to become the first director of a new honors program at Yeshiva College in New York. And I held that position for 3 or 4 years, but I was told throughout that this was not a tenured position. And at that stage, I put out my resume, and to my surprise, I had several nibbles, and of the ones that I was offered. I wasn't sure, coming to Ball State, I wasn't sure whether I should even come. I wasn't sure whether this would be the university I'd want to land up in. And I came here and I was overwhelmed. I felt it really is a great institution. The Honors College was a big attraction as far as I was concerned, and the fact that I could teach both in the English department and the Honors College, that was a joint appointment. And I had to negotiate with the provost at that time, because Carol's work, my wife's work, was still in New Jersey, and it was obvious that if I was going to take up the professorship, I would have to commute. And Warren Vanderhill, whom you've probably met, who was the provost at that time, part of our discussion was, would it be possible to do it this way? And he said, well, as long as you are there for your teaching, and we will honor the fact that you're on a Tuesday-Thursday schedule. And throughout my time at Ball State, the university honored that, which I appreciated a great deal, because to be away from one's family for the middle of the week, not throughout the year, but certainly during the semester, could be a little tough. And there were some things which I regret. I wasn't there to take part in athletic meets for my kids, but I tried my best to make up at weekends.
Going back to your education, so where did you end up graduating from for what?
Well, I did my first degree at the university. You want high school or?
Yes, the high school. What year and when? What was the title?
I graduated from high school in 1963. You want to know how old I was? I think you asked me before. Well, I was born in 1944, so that makes me 74. I graduated in 1963, was accepted into the School of English at the University of Leeds. Did, I suppose, well enough that they wanted me to stay on for graduate work. So both my undergraduate and my doctoral degree are from the same university.
And during your time at the University of Leeds, I saw that you graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in English with honors.
Yes.
Was the honors a specific program, or was it just
No,
certain grades?
I think that's, it's a slight misnomer, if you like, because most university degrees in Great Britain are honours degrees. If you get a pass degree and you're in an honours program, it's somewhat ignominious. And there are various classes that you can get in honours. And depending on how well you've done, you might, if that's your aspiration, you can stay on and do graduate work. And that's what, fortunately, as far as I'm concerned, happened with me. I was actually, it's surprising because at that time, I thought, well, if I don't do it, what am I going to do? And Leeds also had just started something which so many universities, including Ball State, do. They started an MBA program. And as a fallback, if I hadn't got into to graduate work in the School of English, I probably would have gone into business in some form or another. Bearing in mind that my family on my father's side, as I mentioned, they were business people. And that's my father's side. My father's mother's side were all writers, intellectuals, and so I felt I have a bit of each, if you like. But I'm so glad that it's the academic world that I stayed in, because that was and remains my passion.
Was your mother one of the key reasons why you decided to go with an English major when you went into Leeds University?
Did my mother?
Was your mother a key influence in why you decided?
Well, no, I suppose not, because I mean, I think she was just very pleased I got into university in the first place. I mean, we used to joke about it that my parents used to, and particularly my mother, used to joke that if I didn't get into university, I would qualify as a baker's boy. I probably would have had a different career altogether had that happened.
And then from the past discussion we just had, you mentioned that you were at Yeshiva College in New York City.
In New York, yes.
And was that in 1998?
That was in 1998 through to 2002.
Gotcha. And you said you helped create the honors program at Yeshiva College.
Yes.
Could you describe a little bit about how you created the program?
Yes. Let me say, first of all, I hope that's immodest on my part to say that I created it, but I was one of the team, and I was the director of the new honours program. What had happened was that the Felsenstein family, who have given large sums of money to Yeshiva in the past, gave money for the introduction of an honours program. And there was quite some opposition among members of the faculty, because Yeshiva has a high reputation, and they said, well, we don't need an honours program, we're already at that level. But I think the pressure to accept this, which came from the president downwards, that they should accept this, but they couldn't agree among themselves. It's some very good people, but they couldn't agree on who should direct this. And there were people who'd been there for many years, perhaps had very few publications, and they felt they wanted somebody who had published, which I had. But I went there initially just to teach a class, and then halfway through the first semester, they said, would I consider applying for the directorship, and I was granted it. It was an interesting experience, because lots and lots of late nights with committees trying to decide how best to administer this program, to bring people together. One class that I think was very successful, I was able to bring together, probably they knew each other already, but they were nodding acquaintances, a professor of physics and a rabbi who was interested in questions of medicine and health. And I got them to run a class together on Jewish attitudes to medical ethics. And it was a very, very popular and very successful class. But I think, one of the things there was that I was able to bring people like that together, people who had not thought of working together. The other thing which they really hoped that I could do would be to get some honours from individual students. And one of my first students became the first, and maybe I'm quite wrong, I haven't followed in recent years, but I think he is the only Yeshiva College student who got a Rhodes Scholarship. It's been an aspiration here at Ball State to try and get a Rhodes Scholar. It hasn't happened as yet. But he was somebody I taught, and I was responsible for mentoring his honours thesis, and he had his year or 2 years in Oxford, and he's now a rabbi with an Orthodox community somewhere in New York, I think, or New Jersey.
You mentioned the students' honors thesis. Could you describe a little bit more about the structure or the curriculum at Yeshiva College,
well,
the honors program?
I would say that the curriculum was not entirely different from what we have here, except, in New York, you have so many things that you can do, activities. And I had another honors student who's now, I think if he's still there, he was the student rabbi at NYU. That's what he became. He was originally from Canada. He needed to have some experience of cultural life of New York. And so I was able to get some matinee tickets to Swan Lake at Lincoln Center, and I took him to that matinee. He'd never seen anything like this before, and it was somewhat untoward to do something like that. His wife, he was married, his wife was terribly jealous. She said, "Oh, I'd really love to have seen that." But it was these were experiences that were somewhat unusual. Being an Orthodox college, there were some limitations which were designed really more by the rabbis who were in charge of it. But one of the things I was able to do was to organize a summer program, which included, and Ball State does this quite frequently through the Honors College, a study tour to Italy. And previously, most of these students had been abroad, but the only country which they'd visited would be Israel, which makes sense, in terms of what they were doing and to be in a similar Orthodox community. And I was able to set this up, and they were based in Florence with a visit to Venice. In Florence, they enjoyed what they were able to see, but the rabbis, I don't know, have you been to Florence? I don't know whether you've...
I have not.
No, there are a number of honors students who've been on programs which have existed for a long time in the Honors College here. But the rabbis here said, well, we cannot see our Orthodox Jewish students going into the Duomo, into the cathedral there. They can view the outside of the cathedral. They can see the baptistry, which is next door, which has these beautiful Giambologna gates. And they can climb the campanile, the tower, but they're not allowed to go anywhere else. So, there were these strange restrictions, which obviously, if one were running this class here in Ball State, this wouldn't be an issue whatsoever. And there are also questions of eating kosher. And in Florence, they had a vegetarian restaurant. So for days, they were just eating vegetarian food. And then they made the trip to Venice. And they were there for, I think, 3 days, 4 days maybe, and they didn't want to leave Venice. And the reason why was that there was a meat restaurant there. So, it was little things like that which made it somewhat different from organizing programs of this sort. But I thought if that can be done, it can be done anywhere. And it was great to learn when I first came to Ball State that such things existed. And I had prepared a handout with lots of different accounts of visiting Italy by British and by American travellers. I think one French traveller, Doyle, during which I used for the students who went to Italy from yeshiva, and that was used by Dr. Rubel, the previous dean of the Honours College, when he took his students. So it was I was quite pleased that that could be used in the context of this University of Ball State.
And after your time at yeshiva, you mentioned that you came to Ball State in 2002. And when you came, you accepted the position of the Reed D. Varan Honors Distinguished Professor of Humanities. Could you describe what that entailed when you came here?
Well, there's the university lawyers are Varan de Fur, and they endowed this particular professorship, which is based in the Honours College. I believe there was, I never met her, but there was somebody in, I think, psychology who was my predecessor as the Reed D. Varan professor. So
Yes.
I'm the second person to hold that title. The idea was that it would be based in the Honours College, and my successor is entirely within the Honours College. Mine was half in the English department, half in the Honours College, but and I enjoyed both, but I would say my heart was particularly with the Honours College.
And when you first arrived at Ball State, what classes were you teaching in the Honors College?
Well, when I first arrived, my appointment came late in the spring, and they'd already assigned classes to people. So they said, would I do something like a freshman class in the English department? And that was salutary, if you like, for me, because I hadn't done classes like that for many, many years, and I learned a whole lot of things. But I would like to mention that because I think of one of my students who was there. He was a bit older than some of the others, and I thought, extremely bright. His name is Tony West. Extremely bright. He excelled, and he did various classes with me. I thought sufficiently well of him that I suggested, maybe he should be transferred into honours, and Dr. Rubel was happy to allow that to happen. And one of his classes, he even did a graduate class with me, a difficult graduate class on the philosopher John Locke and his influence on 18th century English literature, and he excelled. I mean, he did as well as the graduate students who were there. But let me just tell you a little bit about him. He was somebody who had worked on the shop floor and then as a trade unionist, I think, with Chrysler. And he could see the writing on the wall that this facility, which I think was in Newcastle, Indiana, was going to go and be closed. And at that time, Chrysler offered scholarships or allowed their employees to do further degrees, knowing that maybe they would need that if they were going further. And almost nobody took that up except for Tony, this student. And he graduated from here with honours. He originally thought, he was so interested in books and so on, so he thought, well, maybe his career would be in librarianship. And then he thought again, and he trained as a lawyer. And he's a partner in a firm in Indianapolis, and I think he specializes in trade union law. So, wonderful story of somebody who I met by chance because I was doing that first year, that freshman class, and thought, this is a student who's way above the average there. Was there any way of getting him transferred? And I think one of the things which I don't know whether it's evolved since I was here, but I do feel it's important that there is a later avenue into the Honours College for very gifted students who, for whatever reason, were not in honours right at the very beginning. Tony West was one example of that, a very successful one.
And what were some of the other honors courses that you taught in the first few years?
Well, a number. First of all, I think it was obligatory, and I was so pleased to do it, to teach the sequence. You know, you've probably, or you're in the middle of doing 201, 202, 203. I had, my research is primarily in the 18th century, or was at that time. And what it meant was that I was able to, in taking the whole sequence, look at authors that I had never really studied very closely. I mean, I knew about Ovid, I knew about Virgil, and so on and so forth, Homer, obviously. And to be able to teach a class which included the classics, included going way back, looking at Gilgamesh. And I found that that was very extraordinary because in Gilgamesh there's a Noah-like figure, Usapichin, I think is his name, maybe I mispronounced it, who is so similar in many ways. The story of Noah is there. So it's the idea that there's a biblical story somewhere there, but not ascribed to the book of Genesis as we might know it. And then the other thing which I found very fascinating was, and I used to give a handout of an illustration of the fact that Gilgamesh survives because of the fact that there are a number of these cuneiform tablets which give the story, and they've been able to reconstruct it. But those tablets have been found right across the Middle East. And it suggests, the way in which an oral culture began to become a written culture. So I was very, very interested in that relationship between orality and literacy. And, one might think of Homer's epics as oral and Virgil as literary, and that transition was something which we explored in quite some detail, and I learned a lot by doing it. And I think that any teacher will tell you the same, that if you're not learning from your students, you're not a teacher. That one is gaining all the time, and even looking at the same text with a different group of students and a different pair of eyes, if you're sets of eyes, you come up with new things, and that's exciting. And then to have the same group of students all the way through, I found that very exhilarating indeed. Because I was teaching partly in the English department, partly in the Honours College, it meant that it was a year and a half of doing the sequence. And then I think the sense was that mine was a sort of rather unique position, which where they were hoping to make use of my whatever scholarship I had. And so I ran the Constructions of Otherness class, which was looking at the representation of difference in literary texts, really from the Renaissance through to the early 19th century. And we looked at representations of different groups, Jews, blacks, the French, the Irish, and so on, in literary texts. And there's quite a lot of theory that goes with it. There's some good students who took that. One of the things which I always liked about the Honours College, and it's not something that you would have possibly known about, but every August, prior to the start of the semester, there was an honours faculty retreat. And, all sorts of things were discussed at that time. And I think the second year I was there, Dr. Rubel, the dean, said that one thing that he regretted was that there'd been nobody who'd taught a class on the Holocaust. Is anybody interested in doing it? And I looked around the room, nobody put their hands up, so here was I raising my hand, because I had actually suggested at Yeshiva College that one should do something like that, and there was not very much interest, which surprised me, at a Jewish institution. But I suppose that people had already studied the Holocaust at school, and therefore they felt, there was nothing more that they could do. And so I started a class called Remembering the Holocaust. And I taught it both in the Honours College and in the English department. And my students were very generous about it, but they said, this was a class which they would always remember, and that it changed the whole focus, the way in which they looked at life, and at our institutions in the United States. That we tend to be optimistic about life. What if it went the other way? And I think some of those questions are being asked today. About present-day politics. We were going through a very, very difficult period in present-day American history, and people will look back at that. And I think that students nowadays probably are you can tell me rather than the other way around, are involved with such things. So this was something which I think was of value. Also, a democracy is a wonderful thing as such. We don't realize often how privileged we are in a democracy where we can speak what we wish pretty well. That there are some restrictions. If you come out with racist attitudes, obviously you would be condemned for that. But on the whole, free speech is a building block of what America is about, and we take that for granted, and we never should. President Obama, when he was president, was often asked about democracy, and the adjective that he used to describe it time and time again, I heard him say it several times, the adjective he used was messy. Democracy is messy, but it's also vital. And I think that studying the Holocaust makes one realize how important it is to live in our society in which we can study those things, can discuss them. And sometimes they're very difficult issues which emerge because a policy that we're going to eradicate all people who are different because they happen to be Jewish. Things of this sort. One hopes that nothing of that kind will ever happen in this country. But one's also perhaps aware that when we talk about freedoms in America, there are groups who were unable to take advantage of that, if you like. I mean, that Native Americans were not necessarily there was the US, but also before and after were pretty well eradicated. And if one thinks of the condition of African Americans as slaves, that the history of America and American democracy is not necessarily ideal. It's something which is evolving. And I think that studying the Holocaust made students think about those broader issues.
And going off of that, was there anybody before you got here that you were aware of that were teaching similar courses in Jewish studies at Ball State?
That's an interesting question. There was somebody who was there a little while before, but I'm not quite sure what she was teaching. I am on one of the reasons I was here at this time was that today there was a meeting of the Jewish Studies, the Ziegler Committee, and we organize various things. And one of the aspirations is to have some Jewish studies classes within the university. Sadly, that hasn't happened. When I was at Leeds, I was on a similar committee, and although we were turned down the first time, eventually we were able to set up a Jewish studies program. I'd like that to happen here. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe under the new president, new provost, new dean in the College of Science and Humanities, maybe something like that will emerge. I would hope so. I mean, it's important to be inclusive, and Jews are surely not the only group, but they are an influential one, and I think that Ball State would be stronger with a program like that, bearing in mind that public universities that sometimes we look up to, IU and Purdue, do have very strong Jewish studies programs. I don't think we could necessarily replicate what they're doing, but I still think that it would be valuable to have some classes of that kind. Most Ball State students come from different denominations of Christianity, and they are, I think, and you'll correct me if you feel otherwise, but I think there's a sense of indebtedness to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and so it makes sense to teach both. And the other thing which came up, we were talking about the sequence. In the 19th century, we looked at a critic and writer called Matthew Arnold, and Matthew Arnold talked about two main traditions in Western civilization. One he called Hebraism, which is the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the other he called Hellenism, which is the Greco-Roman tradition. And it's the interchange between the two, which I hope is an important aspect of studying the sequence. I don't know whether your experience, whether you have thought about it in that way.
Along with your classes that you have taught about the Holocaust and with Jewish culture, what are some of your other interests that you have in researching and that you have also offered classes in?
That I researched, or?
Yes, what are some of your research interests?
Well, my research, I did my doctorate on what's known as the 18th century Grand Tour, so there were travelers from Britain who went to France and Italy and other European countries. And one in particular, 18th century novelist called Tobias Smollett, he was from Scotland. And as my doctoral work, I worked on and edited Travels Through France and Italy, which is his travel work, which I thought had been rather pushed to obscurity. After I'd finished my doctorate, I was very fortunate, long story, but to cut it short, Oxford University Press took it on, and it's one of those sort of Clarendon books, which sits in libraries probably and gathers dust, but they then asked me to re-edit it with a shorter introduction and so on as a world's classics, and it went through several editions, and more recently Broadview text in Canada have taken it over, and I had to re-edit it for for the Broadview series. So that became part of my Constructions of Otherness class, looking at representation. He was a very bad-tempered traveller, but very amusing, and it's a very lively work. So we looked at that in context. And then another piece of work which I was engaged in is an 18th century, originally 17th century, slave narrative. It's the story of Inkle and Yarico. And Yarico is the sort of Caribbean version, if you like, of Pocahontas. Very similar story, except it has a rather nasty twist at the end. The story, and I'm simplifying it a little bit, but Inkle is a young English merchant on the make who goes out to the Caribbean. He and his shipmates are wrecked on some island. His shipmates are killed or eaten by the savages. He crawls away and is befriended by an Indian maiden. Her name is Yarico. They become lovers. He promises her, they have an innocent retreat together, and she hides him from her fellows. He promises that if they should escape, he'll take her to England, make her into his wife. Somehow or other, they hail a passing English ship. They get aboard, and en route, the first port of call is Barbados. When they arrive in Barbados, he immediately sells her into slavery and doubles the price when he finds that she's pregnant with his child. So it's a horrible story in many ways, but one which captured the 18th century imagination. And I found that there were probably 60 or 80 different versions of that story, retellings in poetical form, as drama, even a pantomime, epistles, sequences, and so on. And I collected the main ones into a volume which Johns Hopkins brought out. It's called English Trader, Indian Made, and it looks at the story. And it's considered as one of the foundational myths when one talks about the history of servitude in the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean. There were American versions of it as well. So I used that as part of the class. And then I'd written a book on representations of the Jews in 18th century popular culture, really from about 1660 to 1830. But I started further back with the medieval representation, with the Merchant of Venice in the Renaissance period, Shylock, right through the 18th century and into the 19th century. My sort of terminal figure was Charles Dickens and the figure of Fagin in Oliver Twist. So there was plenty of material to choose from, which I used as part of the class. So one was able to take representations of the Jews, partly from the work that I'd done there, representations of the blacks through Inkle and Yerrico, through other works, Orinoco, Robinson Crusoe, and so on. And each of those, sort of, I think, had its resonance, and representations of the French, of course, through Smollett's Travels Through France and Italy, and other works that we looked at. So it was possible to see how racial and national prejudice was a dominant issue in the 18th century, and one could talk about it without the kind of restraints that you might have, if you're looking at present day ideas, because many of the attitudes that were put forward were racist as such. But because they belong to a historical period, one could talk about them far more easily than one might be able to do with the present day. So one of the things that we looked at were 18th century jests, many of which were pretty racist. But if one told those stories now from the present day, one would be probably kicked out of university, and they would be thought of as highly discriminatory. But because one was seeing them in a historical context, it was possible to discuss those things.
Earlier in the interview, you were mentioning Dr. Rubel and his role as Dean of the Honors College. Could you elaborate a little bit more and give some of the experiences you maybe had with him as the Dean of the Honors College?
I was so happy to have Jim Rubel as the Dean, with whom I worked closely. We had many close discussions about different issues. He was always extremely supportive of ideas that I would have. Between us, we started something which now has become a lecture series where different members of faculty, there was one today where my successor as the Varan professor spoke. But I started as a series of breakfast discussions, and we got honors faculty to talk about questions of pedagogical questions, how you teach a particular thing. If you've not had experience of teaching a medieval French text, how do you do it? Well, somebody from the French department would be able to help you with that. And people would talk about their research. And so Jim and I set that up. One other initiative which I was very pleased about was to do with the Shakespeare class, that it struck me as peculiar that Ball State didn't invite a Shakespeare company to come and perform on an annual basis on campus. And I was able to reach out to the Cincinnati Shakespeare Company, and they have a traveling group, and that's now become an annual event. One of the things that literally brought tears to my eyes was when we would go to Cincinnati, and we not only would they come here, but I would take a group there, and I would always have one or two students who would, after the performance, they'd really enjoyed it. It's the first time I've seen a live Shakespeare play. And I thought, well, that's achieving something, and many of them said, there are 36, 37 other plays by Shakespeare. During our lifetime, we want to see every single one of them. and I hope some of them are still have that aspiration. I felt that was a very valuable thing, and Jim's family came from Cincinnati, so he particularly relished the fact that we were doing that. And as I say, I think also the fact that he was enthusiastic about my doing a Holocaust class. Those are just a few examples of the ways which we interacted on a professional level.
You may have touched on this a little bit, but was there any pushback you ever had from the Honors College potentially about honors colloquium topics? I know they range from a wide variety. Did you ever have any difficulties getting any ideas that you wanted to teach taught in the Honors College?
No, I think if anything it was the opposite. It was encouragement to do this. And one other thing, for various family reasons, my wife, whilst I was here, was involved in an accident where she dislocated her shoulder, and I'd been here about 13 and a half years at that time, and sort of traveling backwards and forwards. And I felt, here was I in Indiana, and there she was in New Jersey, and I felt, this is something I have to be home. And Jim was very supportive, and in fact suggested that maybe I should be teaching online classes, so I could be at home. And so for the last 3 semesters of my teaching here, my presence was an online presence. And it was a learning experience for me, but it also showed that you could run online distance learning classes of this kind, and they do work. And in some departments in the College of Sciences and Humanities, there's been opposition to that. I think partly because they feel if there were so many classes like that, it might prejudice the appointment of new professors, because they'll say, well, we can always get somebody to teach online. And you'll find that in some of the, I won't mention individual departments, but some of the College of Science and Humanities departments, there's a very, very poor presence of online classes. It was an extraordinary learning experience for me because I'd never done anything like that. I think that both my students and Dr. Rubel and then Dr. Emmett were pleased with the way that these classes went. I also should add that for me, it was a new experience. I mean, I felt like a beginning lecturer. I mean, I remember when I first started at the University of Leeds that I had a weekly lecture with about 300 students. And so I was really like a hermit during the week, sort of writing down my lecture. I mean, it was a time when I wanted to write everything down. I think I'm probably a little bit more experienced now, and I can work from notes and ad lib. But at that time, I needed to have a text like that. And when I started doing the online teaching, particularly the Shakespeare class, but also the Holocaust class, you need to be able to impart some of the ideas which would have just come up in discussion in the classroom if I were teaching on campus. And so for each week I would prepare a lecture, and sometimes 2 lectures, on different aspects of Shakespeare and so on, and those were recorded and were used. And so the first time I did this was a huge amount of work. The second when I was repeating them, it was much easier because most of those lectures were in place. A few changes because I might refer to things for which were in sequence for the first year, and then one might want to change it for the second year. But I was so pleased to be able to do that, and even more pleased that Dr. Rubel particularly, and Dr. Majotto in the College of Sciences and Humanities, the dean there, that they both supported my doing this.
And multiple times you've mentioned the Shakespeare classes that you've had for the honors colloquium. Did you ever have an opportunity to take those classes on a study abroad trip with the course?
That would have been ideal to do that, and I regret I didn't. But it might have been possible to do that, to bring them to to Great Britain. But no, I didn't do that.
Were there any limitations that kept you back from doing that, or was it just not available?
I imagine if one had pushed very hard, one could have done that. My primary thing was to introduce students to Shakespeare. They might have, sort of been turned off at high school. I do remember, a couple of plays that I studied whilst I was in the equivalent of the 11th and 12th grade sixth form, lower and upper sixth in Britain. And those plays, I was turned off for a while, but returned to them since. And I felt that one could just look at these individual plays in sequence. I asked my students to do an awful lot. I mean, we started by looking at non-dramatic Shakespeare, and that meant particularly the sonnets. And I got the students to think about, and this evolved really from teaching the sequence, to think about how the sonnet evolved, because it was originally an Italian form. And why should it be a 14-line poem, and what is dramatic about it, and how can one talk about Shakespeare's sonnets, and the fact that the subject of so many of the sonnets is not a woman but a young man. Should one see this as should one see this as the sequence as homosexual in what it's doing? And then those last poems, which are written to the Dark Lady, and are very erotic poems as such. So there's something very dramatic about the whole sequence, and the sense in which this is a sort of three-way relationship, that one can relate what happens with his relationship with the young man and with the Dark Lady, as she's called, and Shakespeare himself. So there's already something very dramatic in the so-called non-dramatic poetry. And then we would go on to a play like Love's Labour's Lost, in which the poets or the protagonists in the play are mouthing sonnets, and in Romeo and Juliet as well, that Romeo's wooing of Juliet. There's a perfect sonnet in his opening relationship with her. So we were moving from non-dramatic to dramatic poetry, and then looking at history plays, which are much easier for British students to understand, but we talked about them as political plays, and then looking at some of the comedies and tragedies. I usually tried to include, as well as the sonnets, 8 plays, which is quite a lot to do in a single semester.
One of the things that we've talked about in the honors colloquium we are in right now for the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project, it's actually in Dr. Gail Hood and Dr. Tony Edmonds' book, is the lack of say faculty might have had in student affairs throughout their history. Did you by chance have any experiences with the faculty maybe not being heard as much as you would have liked to have been at Ball State?
Heard by whom?
By the administration, the board of trustees.
No, I didn't find any such problems, except, as I say, we attempted to set up a Jewish studies program, and that didn't work out.
Then one of the other major projects that you've worked on here at Ball State is the What Middletown Read project.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit more
on that? Well, I'm so glad
please?
that you should ask about What Middletown Read. I suppose it's, if you like, the work of the left hand, but I've, from the beginning of my career as a professor or lecturer, and then more senior at Leeds, I taught a class on the history of the book, and I would do things on editing, but also on the evolution of the book as we know it. And the way in which I taught this class at Ball State, I wanted it to reflect what's available on campus and nearabouts. And I think you have to tailor such a class to the individual location where you're teaching at the university or college where you're teaching that class. So the very first time I was about to teach it, and it was a fall class, and in the spring I got in touch with the local archives. There was a genealogy centre by the Muncie Public Library in downtown Muncie. And I asked them, would it be acceptable if I brought a group of students down to talk about, so they could show them what an archive is and what that's about. And I got this strange reply, no, you can't. And the long and short of it was that the Carnegie Library, this was in 2003, 2004, was just coming up to its centenary. And they had spent a lot of money renovating it, so it was closed during that spring, but it turned out that it was open in the fall when I was going to run this class. So I went down there just a few weeks before to discuss with the person I'd been in touch with what one might do for this individual class. And she said, well, I'm not sure we have anything for you. However, whilst we were doing the renovation, we found all these boxes up in the attic. Would you like to have a look at them? And so I said, yes, well, not sure. And I came away so excited with what I'd found, because what they had were the ledgers of individual borrowing of every single book through most of the 1890s and the first couple of years of the 20th century. We found, as we worked on this, there were 175,000 transactions thereabouts. With so we had the books themselves, the catalogues of the books. We had catalogues of who the patrons were, and we were able to tie the patrons list to the 1900 US Census. One of the things I discovered, which I didn't know, many things I don't know, but I mean this was an important thing that I didn't know, was that the 1890 US Census was consumed in a fire, that it doesn't exist except for just a few fragments. But fortunately the 1900, so the 1890 wasn't there, but the 1900 one was, and that cut right through our period. And from that we were able to find out who the various patrons were. We were able to see, what their social background was. So if you wanted to know what books, shall we say, a working class woman who was a member of the library would read at that time, and what were the most popular books, how often were they read. And the slight misnomer, we called it, I decided, because you probably know that Ball State has a Centre for Middletown Studies, and that's because Robert and Helen Lind wrote this seminal book called Middletown, and they chose Muncie as their town but didn't name it as such. But the university has the Centre for Middletown Studies. So I got in touch with Bruce Gielhood, who at that time was the director. He was about to step down. And James Connolly, who's still the director, was about to take over. And Jim and I worked very, very closely together. We were able to get external, first of all, seed money from the Provost's office, and then smaller external grants, and then a pretty large grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we had a sort of twofold process. One was to bring out a database, which is freely available, accessible anywhere in the world. If you log into What Middletown Read, if you Google those words, you'll find it. And to bring out a book based on these two things. So the database was completed in 2011, and our book came out about 4 years later, late 2015, I think it was, that it came out, and a further book of essays related to it has come out subsequently. It put Ball State very much on the map in terms of book history, because nobody else, and it's still the case, nobody else has been able to find those records. It's so rare that you will find records of that kind that have survived. Now, what does one do with the records? Well, on one side, you have to identify the books. And we were very fortunate that in the library, there was a team of people who were able to find out exactly which edition of each book. But when it came to the patrons of the library, we had to research those, and we would look at Muncie directories from the late 1890s into 1900. We would look at census records, as I mentioned, and various other things. But who was going to do that? And that's where the Honours College came in, that we had some wonderful support from students who were rather similar to you. And it was their first taste of research, if you like, that they were doing cutting-edge research in finding out about who these people were. And in some cases, they didn't succeed in identifying who the readers were, but in most cases, they were. And several people who did this. I mean, I'm just going to give an example of one student who did my history of the book class and then was involved as well in the What Middletown Read project. She was a junior and then a senior in the College of Architecture and Planning, and had thought about becoming an architect. She came and saw me, and she was actually chosen as the student to give the commencement speech, at the time of graduation. They thought, well, brilliant future in architecture. She came to see me, she said, really what we've been doing, I am so interested in going into librarianship. And so she got herself a position and then went on to get qualifications, and she's now working as a librarian. I'm not quite sure which college she's at the present time, but this was one example of somebody who was so taken by it, and it really developed her career. I had another student who was a friend of hers who combined, she did my Shakespeare class and she did the history of the book class, and she went through Muncie newspapers from the 1890s and found out about Shakespeare productions, and then used the What Middletown Read database to see who was borrowing books on Shakespeare. So it created quite a lot of interesting things. And whilst we were preparing it, we were asking ourselves, well, what kind of use, who would be using it? And sometimes you got surprising things. For instance, shortly after the database was made available digitally throughout the world, somebody came out with a book on Napoleon in America. And he used the database to find, which books about Napoleon were being read, who borrowed them, and a whole lot of data. So part of his book was based on what he could find on the What Middletown Read database. So you never know what kind of use will be made of it, but it is something which, and I think there's still a steady use by people who are teaching book history, which is a developing program, by people who are in library science, perhaps in museum work even, and general researchers who are using the database on a consistent basis. When we published the online version in 2011, we were using technology which was available at that time. We're now in 2019, and we're thinking about what has happened in the digital world, and there are ways in which perhaps there'll be a version 2. And I'm still involved with that, although I'm retired. It's something which I've been working with Jim Connolly. I mean, he has the burden for it being on faculty here, but it's exciting to know that has a continuing life.
You mentioned that honor students were a part of helping create the project. Do you believe that their experiences in honors courses helped them be more successful on the project?
Unquestionably, that's so. And if you have a look at the database, we've included under acknowledgements the names of most of those students. Some that we didn't get there, we put into the book. As I say, I think unquestionably the students that we had were very, very valuable. I mean, there was one student who had used GIS, geographical imaging systems or whatever, and she created a version of our findings, which showed which part of Muncie various readers of different social backgrounds came from. You know, that was something we'd not thought of, but it was her idea. And she did her honours thesis on it, and it was very good. And I had somebody else who was in your field of telecommunications, and she did and I think you can get it from the library. She did a video about the creation of the database and what that was about. So we had various students who benefited from it in different ways. But I think on the other side, we benefited unbelievably from the input of honours students, and we had some students, including graduates from the English department, some students including graduates from the history department, but the lion's share was students from the honours college. And again, you know, I'm so grateful to Dr. Rubel that every year when I approached him, said, you know, is there money that we can pay for 2 or 3 researchers to be, and then sometimes more than that, to be working on our project. And he was willing to do that. And then, of course, we got this large grant from the NEH, and it was less necessary to approach Jim each time and say, you know, well, have you got the funding? But he was always so generous and recognized the importance of this. I also, in just thinking about Jim, he was an extraordinary classicist, and so it was, for me as somebody who worked in a different field, it was, I mean, I would sit at his knees and listen to him talking about individual works which he had studied and which he knew about. And you know, I think the fact that one had a first-rate scholar who was, which we have now as well with with Dr. Emmett, the present dean, that is what the Honours College is about, to have people who are cutting edge within their fields, and that they can, and many of the teachers in the Honours College, that's the same, that they can impart some of their knowledge, and they can also, as I mentioned earlier, learn from the students they're teaching.
One of the concepts that is very prevalent now at Ball State University is immersive learning. Were these opportunities immersive learning classes?
Do you know, that was a difficult area, because the previous president, Bar 1, was Dr. Joanne Gorer, and she had particular ideas as to what constituted an immersive learning class. I'm not sure that she necessarily considered this to be immersive, but I was never able to pin her down in terms of her precise definition of what she considered to be immersive. To my mind, they were, but I'm not sure whether they were counted as such.
Then going back just a little bit to when you first started at Ball State and some of the experiences you have had here, how did the classes you have taught at Ball State compare to your time at Yeshiva College in New York?
Well, Yeshiva College had a high reputation, still has, partly because it has an outstanding medical school. The Einstein Medical School is part of that, and the Jewish Studies program is very strong. I think there were some shortcomings in other fields. There were some very good scholars in individual departments, some outstandingly good teachers. But I would say that the standard in the Honours College here, if anything, is higher than I found at Ball State and at Yeshiva College, I'm sorry, which you know, is a research one university. Ball State is not necessarily considered as such, but at an undergraduate level, I would say that that most of the students in the Honours College would grace a research one university just as well, and so that was exciting for me, having taught at Leeds, you know, which is very much of that kind of thing. So I remember the vice chancellor, that would be the equivalent of the president at Leeds. He was a peer. His name was Lord Boyle, Edward Boyle. And he described a university as teaching in an atmosphere of research. And I think that could apply pretty precisely to the Honours College at Ball State.
So as you mentioned earlier, you have taught both English classes and honors classes. Could you describe maybe some of the differences you've seen in the students between non-honors classes and honors classes?
Well, I think it would be a total mistake to say, oh, well, the English students were of a lesser level. Let's say that there was much greater variety, greater range of ability in the English department. That I worked my honours students pretty hard throughout. And I knew that whatever I threw at them, they would, they would respond. It was very rare that you had students who did not. I'll give you one example where it didn't work for two students in the honours colloquium. Between 202 and 203, there was a Christmas break, New Year's break, and I asked the students to read Flaubert, to read Madame Bovary. And I had two students who came and said, this is vacation time, why should I do that? I was highly surprised. I never came across that. I think one other example I had maybe of one student who did not pursue it, but otherwise those two or three examples, I would work my students very, very hard, and I knew that they would respond. I didn't even have to think about it, whereas with the English department, it was more of a push, let's put it that way.
Do you believe pushing the honors students more in those classes made the classes more valuable for the students and yourself as well? I believe you mentioned earlier that you were still learning. One of the things you always did as a professor was keep learning from your students.
I hope so. I mean, I hope it rubbed off both ways. If it didn't, then I'm a failure as a teacher.
And as a professor in the Honors College, one of the things that we have found is for most of its time, it has been a paper college, so it has not had any financial support or as much as some of the other colleges. At Ball State, did you by chance have any difficulties as a faculty member with this idea of being a paper college, or any struggles for things you wanted for your classes?
Well, I was always aware that Dr. Rubel had to fight for any financial help. And he was remarkably good at doing that, and sometimes he voiced his frustration to me and possibly to other people, but he was sufficiently generous to be open with me about some of those things. But I cannot think of an example of anything in particular where I wasn't able to go ahead. Perhaps it might have been difficult, you were asking me about taking a group of students on a Shakespeare class, but I think even that would have been possible had I pushed to do it, and mea culpa that I didn't.
And to continue with the idea of the Honors College, with different things they acquired within the past decade, they had in 2009, the Edmund F. and Virginia Ball House renovated, and it is now the home of the Honors College. Did that have an impact on your teaching here at Ball State?
Oh yes, because prior to that we were on the edge of campus in Carmichael Hall, and we very much felt that we were just that, on the edge of things, and moving to its present location centralized everything. It put the Honors College right in the heart of the university, where deservedly it should be.
Do you by chance recall any of the comments you might have heard from students about the move to the central part
I think
of
most
campus?
people were happy with it. I mean, maybe I missed on some people who were not, but I can't see that one could be anything other than happy. Obviously, the building is not sufficiently large for us to have all our classes there, but I certainly, Ball 200 was a lovely room to run my seminars in, and I was always slightly disappointed if it was elsewhere. That would be my first choice.
Could you compare the classrooms between the Honors House and Carmichael Hall?
Well, Carmichael Hall was not necessarily, I don't know what its previous history was, but I don't think it was only intended for honours. And there were other, I cannot remember which departments, but there were other sections of the university that were in there, and there was no sense of individuality in the way that I feel, and intimacy in the way that you might feel that the Honours House gives us today.
So one other thing I am curious about is, during your time at Ball State, have there been any struggles you've had with classes, or any people or people at Ball State that have kind of maybe held you back from some of the things you've wanted to do here?
Well, I had one or two occasions when a class would not make, but usually when that happened, I would find an alternative class which was acceptable. But I'm talking about the exception rather than the rule, that this would happen. And certainly the Holocaust, the Shakespeare class, the book history class, they would fill up pretty well. And what was wonderful and remains wonderful about the Honours College, of course, is the fact that you have students from so many different disciplines who are able to bring their knowledge into the classroom. So if we take the Holocaust class as an example, I had people who were studying theology, religious studies, who were able to talk about moral aspects of of what was happening in the Holocaust. On the other hand, I would have fashion students. I had one particular student who was interested in what she called Nazi chic. What was the style of clothes that people wore, and how did those differ from those people who were ostracized, and sent to the camps. So, can one think of a greater difference? And yet each of those students was able to contribute something valuable to the success of the class.
Going back to the faculty side of the Honors College, so the Honors College has an interdisciplinary faculty, and you mentioned on some of the retreats you would all gather up and discuss ideas. Were there any tensions or struggles between different areas of the faculty based on different colleges they were in?
No, I think not. I think that people came to the Honours College because they wanted to work together. I talked with Dr. Emmett this morning, and he was telling me about one faculty member who had retired, and I remember having a discussion with her because she'd been teaching partly in the English department, partly in the Honours College. She confided in me at that time. She said, the only reason I want to stay on is because of the Honours College. And I think that people across the university who engaged with the Honours College, that was an enlightening experience for them. Last night I had dinner with a former colleague who taught in the College of Architecture and Planning, and he was a brilliant teacher in the teaching the sequence and other classes, but he was one of relatively few within that college. And I think it's always been an effort, if you like, to get the chairperson of a particular department to release an individual who might have wanted to teach in the Honours College. And some departments are more generous than others in allowing those releases. And you were talking about the fact that the Honours College did not have its own budget. So, we really relied very much on the goodwill of those departments from which they came. I had that experience already at Yeshiva College. And I might add also that one of the reasons why I was appointed to the position as director of the honours program at Yeshiva College was that whilst I was at Leeds, we had a number of external colleges that were introducing honours programs. And the title was moderator. I was the moderator, the person in the School of English who liaised with those individual colleges, and there were about half a dozen different colleges. So I'd had quite a lot of experience of setting up honours programs and honours work as such, and that held me in good stead, I think, both at Yeshiva College and more particularly here at Ball State.
Continuing with the idea of the faculty of the Honors College, so the Honors College actually was able to finally hire its own faculty in 2013. After that happened, did you see any changes in the Honors College?
Well, I think it strengthens the Honours College. I mean, there's no doubt about it, because you often had that sort of tension between, the demands of the home college, if you like, and the demands of the Honours College, and the home college, I say home department, really could dictate whether its faculty could be released to teach in the Honours College. And that, if you're short of staff in any case, and you're not certain whether you're going to get replacements, it requires a generosity on the part of a departmental chair to say, yes, I'd like such and such a faculty to be teaching a class in the Honours College.
And then going back to some of the classes you have taught here at Ball State, so one of them that I found was called From Gutenberg to Google. So was there an idea that you had to keep your classes or honors colloquium connected to the present day?
Well, the idea of from Gutenberg to Google, we started at that very early period which I talked about with the Honours 201, where you're talking about an oral culture. We nowadays, when we think about reading, we think about that as any cultured group, but one should, Muncie would be an example of the late 19th century. It's a large proportion of people who were illiterate. And we think of, obviously at university, the ability to read is something which we totally take for granted. But I think we should realize, I used to ask my students, let's talk about Homer, and let's talk about Odysseus, the wiliest of the Greeks. You've probably, did you read the Odyssey, or are you reading the Odyssey as part of your Honours 201? I don't know whether it came up. You're nodding that you...
I believe I did.
Yes, good. So, he's the one who thought out the idea of the wooden horse, and he was the Greek who was, I think, accredited with being the cleverest, and so his role in the Iliad, and then of course the Odyssey, which is all about his return to Ithaca. And I would ask my students, what do you think Odysseus read? They would look around and some of them would say, well, maybe there were texts that were there. But my sense is that Odysseus, if he was a real person, which he probably wasn't, but if he was, is that he would have been illiterate. We take literacy for granted now in a civilized world, but literacy is something which is relatively recent. The Jewish tradition is that, 5,700 and something years of Judaism, or some people say since the creation of the world. I sometimes wonder whether that relates to the beginning of literacy. We've maybe 6,000 years mankind has evolved towards being a literate society, even though there are many people who are still illiterate. So we would start with that. And then we would go on we'd move forward to the age of Gutenberg. And if you think about it, in a scribal culture, primarily in the monasteries, you would have monks, and then outside the monasteries, you would have scriptoria which were run by secular people, and they were related to the university. And you'd have texts copied for you, so you could read those in class. But you can imagine the laborious process that it took to copy a particular manuscript and to make it available for a very select group of students. Gutenberg's invention of printing from movable type meant that overnight you could produce 100 or even 1,000, 1,500 copies of the same work using type as such. It's a total revolution. I think that the Renaissance, as we know it, the arts and culture which we associate with it, the Reformation, that Martin Luther's ideas should have spread across Europe, whereas earlier reformers went nowhere almost, that these incredible changes and developments would not have taken place without printing from movable type. So that was, if you like, a starting point. 500 years of printing from movable type. We're now in a new era in which digitized texts are available through the computer and so on, and that learning has become something quite different as a result of that. What sort of socio-economic changes have taken place as a result, and can one compare them with what happened in the age of Gutenberg 500 years before? We're in the middle of that extraordinary technological shift or change, and it's possible to think about that. Now, I had several parts of the class. One of them was called Time and the Book, the measurement of time and how that was done. Another one was called Space and the Book. And what we were looking at was the way in which people saw the world. And the world was viewed from way back biblical times, Aristotle and so on, as geocentric. The universe revolves around the Earth. The Earth is the center of the universe. And then along comes Copernicus and later Galileo, and they say, well, actually the Earth is just a very small part of a much larger heliocentric system. So we would look at that. We would look at literary texts. One of the prime examples would be John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost is about the creation of the world and in Christian terms, the fall of man. And there's an extraordinary book it's an epic, rather like we've talked about Virgil as a writer of epic. There's an extraordinary interchange between Adam and the archangel Raphael. And Adam still believes in the ancient geocentric system, and Raphael says, well, what if, there might be something. So Milton is right at the center of this scientific debate which is taking place at that time. And there were other, I won't go into it, but there were quite a number of other literary texts, and I'd have a handout with some of those that we would look at. So that would be one class. Then we'd have another class up in the Bracken Library. There's a map room. I don't know if you've used it, but we'd look at cartography, the way in which the universe was represented, and there were people in that office who were able to show us the shifts that took place. And that night, we would go to the planetarium, and the director of the planetarium would show us, as we looked at the heavens, the way in which the geocentric, the ancient system, made sense to people, and then how that changed with the new heliocentric system. So you can imagine that I had people in the arts, but I also had science students who found that was fascinating in terms of the history of science. So that was just one example of the kind of change that took place because of Gutenberg's invention. One could talk about representations of the world in terms of Christianity at that time, and again there would be major changes. As I say, I think that Luther would have got nowhere, but bar the fact that his works were printed and disseminated and made available. And then when we went back to ancient times, in ancient times there were attempts to create libraries that would contain all of knowledge. So one that we concentrated on was the library at Alexandria, the Egyptian library, sadly destroyed by the Romans. But all of knowledge, as far as we had it, was contained within that library. In the late 19th century, and we could go back to Muncie there, to the Carnegie Library. Andrew Carnegie spent millions of dollars millions of pounds as well, to create libraries in the Anglophone world, so in Britain, in colonies in the United States, Canada, and so on and so forth. There are about 1,600 Carnegie libraries that were created across the English-speaking world. And Andrew Carnegie, who'd never had a university education himself, his idea was that he wanted to make knowledge available to all, and it's an important part of the democratic process that should be. If you think about what Google is doing now to make knowledge available, it's the same thing. So Alexandria, Carnegie, and Google, it's the same mission, but using different techniques for it. So I mean, there were wonderful ways in which one could connect different periods, and I hope I've explained why it was interesting to look at the age of Gutenberg and see it in the context of the present time.
Then as we come a little bit nearer to the end of the interview, what were some of the things during your time at Ball State that you saw as significant changes in the university?
Well, I think the university has expanded during that time. I was very pleased that there's now a College of Health that is very valuable. One of the things about online teaching, as I did in the Honours College, was I think the notion there was that we would, among other people, attract students who were, shall we say, on a study abroad thing, and they could do an online class at their leisure. We also thought about students in the School of Nursing who have irregular hours and could not, and there were quite a number of nursing students who took, for instance, my Holocaust class, and they were interested in, eugenics and the medical issues which evolved under the Nazi regime. And I talked to my students several times about why they were doing, particularly at the beginning, why they were doing this class, and some of them were because they were abroad and they wanted to do it. Others, as I say, nursing or whatever, or out on teaching practice and needing to do a class. But I was put in my place by one particular student. I asked him, well, why are you doing this class? He said, well, I can do it from home and I don't want to leave my cat on its own. Completely different reason for doing a class like that. Whether he was being facetious or otherwise, he sounded very serious when he said that.
And as you've mentioned, you retired in 2017
Correct.
From Ball State. You mentioned that one of the reasons for that was your wife's health.
Well, fortunately, she's recovered fully from that. But I did feel that, had we been living in Indiana, particularly if we were living in Muncie, that would not have been an issue. I would have been there, but my family obviously comes first. I love the work that I have been privileged to do here at Ball State, but there's no question that one's number one is one's wife, one's children, one's family, and I think that was a wake-up call for me that really I should think about retiring. And Carol was she, as I say, worked for an international company, and then she branched out and created her own business, which was very successful. She then sold that business and decided to retire. So it was my turn to do that as well. And since then, we've done extensive traveling. I mean, we've been to China, we've been to India, I've just come back from Australia. We are off to England next week. My godson is getting married. So I mean, these are things I could not have done in mid-semester without, shall we say, the excuse of a conference somewhere. I think whilst we're physically, touch wood, in good shape, these are things that we should do, and I've enjoyed doing them, and also, as I say, still working on trying to complete the book based on my parents' experience during the 1930s.
You just mentioned your family. Could you talk a little bit about maybe your children as well?
Yes, I'd be more than happy and very proud to talk about them. They both were born in Britain. and came over when they were 7 and 3. So I think they feel more American than British. Like me, they have dual nationality. I think Carol, my wife, is the only one who just has American citizenship, and we've often thought that there's an advantage in having dual nationality, and until whatever happens with Brexit, it meant that my children, if they wanted to work in the European Union, could do that, and maybe they'll only be able to work in Britain without a work permit, should they so wish. My son he followed actually his mother to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He went there with the notion of doing international relations. One of his a cousin of his, whom he looked up to, she had done international relations at the University of California, so he thought he would do that. A week after getting there, he called us and said, "I've changed my mind, I want to be pre-med." And it shocked us because he dropped many science classes, and he was passionate about that's what he really wanted to do. And the first year, because he had to catch up with a whole lot of things, his grades were not wonderful, but then he rose and rose, and by the end of graduating he was pretty high up. And he was accepted to do a master's degree based at the NIH in Washington. It's the Hopkins master's degree. And on the strength of that, he was accepted again at the University of Colorado, where he's doing an MD PhD, which is a very long process. You're becoming a medical doctor, but you're also doing a PhD. And the idea is you do the first 2 years of medical school, then you go 4 or 5 years doing the PhD, and the final 2 years at medical school. And Kenny was doing, I think, pretty well with it. He worked with 2 professors, 2 PIs, principal investigators. One was based in Denver, the other one in Boulder. He went last May, I think it was, to have a meeting with the one in Denver, who's been the more significant of these 2. And he turned to Kenny and said, "Kenny, I have to tell you, I've just accepted a job at Cedars-Sinai in California." And 2 days later, he went up to Boulder and spoke to his PI there. "Kenny, I've just accepted a job in Copenhagen." So Kenny was like an orphan, he was devastated by what had happened. But the long and the short of it is that the professor who moved to Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles wanted Kenny to join him, and Kenny's finishing his PhD there, and then he'll have to return to the University of Colorado to do the last 2 years of medical school. Our daughter, Joanna, she went to the College of New Jersey which is about an hour and a half from where our home is, with the notion of, she's from early teens, she's always talked about wanting to be a teacher and to teach elementary and primary education and also special needs kids. And she felt very strongly that she would, perhaps rather following her dad, because I went to Switzerland as my first job at the University of Geneva, she wanted to teach abroad. And she's become a teacher at the Colegio Alberto Einstein in Quito, in Ecuador. And she had the option of, she's completing her second year, she had the option of doing a third year there, and decided that she wants to come back to the United States, partly because they did not give her sufficient opportunity to practice her knowledge of special needs, and she doesn't want to lose that. And so she's in process of applying for jobs at an American school somewhere. We're not quite sure where at the moment, but I'm sure she put out her resume, and people wrote back to her, can you break your contract with the Colegio? Come immediately. So I think she obviously wants to complete the contract, but I would be very surprised if she doesn't find a job there. Both of them thought about Ball State, and in some ways I think Kenny would have fitted very, very well into the honors college here. I suppose that there was a sense in which, there's already a family tradition. My wife is a graduate of Johns Hopkins, where she did her undergraduate degree. Johns Hopkins University Press has published 2 of my books, so we had strong links there, if you like, and still a lot of friends in the region. And Joanna, my daughter, she felt that she wanted to get qualifications which would allow her to teach out east. And although Teachers College here would have, and they offered her a position, it would not necessarily have been one which would have accorded with what she planned to do afterwards. So neither of them, slightly to my regret, came to study here. And it's not in any sense casting aspersions on Ball State. I mean, these were decisions which were made based on quite a number of considerations.
I can't remember if we've mentioned, what is your wife's name again?
Carol.
Carol.
Carole. Okay.
And as we come near to the end of our time for the interview, do you have any final comments, stories, or memories you would like to share?
No, I would just say that to my mind, this has been a wonderful experience for me. I mean, I think is, if you like, the latter end of my professional career as a teacher, and I think I was hopefully able to bring some of that experience which I'd had at other institutions to bring to bear here at Ball State. When I was accepted, I'm sorry, it sounds a little bit like, in fact it is crowing a little bit, but I had two offers. One was at quite a prestigious private university, a Catholic university, to be chair of the English department. And I was in for the final interview to be the director of a very large public university in Michigan, but did not go for the final interview because I really liked what I'd seen at Ball State. And when I was offered this position, I felt this was something I really wanted to do because it allowed me to continue with my teaching and to continue with research. It was an important juncture because I think you find with a lot of academics, you come to a point where you decide, well, do I really want to go into administration and to be, the chair of an English department at this rather prestigious private university, or to be director of an honours program at a very, very large public university? It was tempting. And I thought, well, that's something which would be fulfilling. But I think my primary love was teaching and research, and Ball State fitted the bill perfectly.
With that, we'll bring the interview to an end. On behalf of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project, I'd like to thank you for coming today and sharing your story with us as we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Ball State Honors College.
Well, congratulations on that, and thank you for including me as one of your interviewees. I've enjoyed that greatly.